Welcome to the Partial Historians.
We explore all the details of ancient Rome.
Everything from political scandals, the love affairs, the battles waged, and when citizens turn against each other. I'm Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G. We consider Rome as the Romans saw it, by reading different authors from the ancient past and comparing their stories.
Join us as we trace the journey of Rome from the founding of the city.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of The Partial Historians. I am one of your hosts, Dr. G.
And I am Dr. Rad.
And we are very excited to sit down today with Owen Rees to talk about his new book, The Far Edges of the Known World. Even the title sounds very impressive. I'm like, ooh. Owen Rees is an ancient historian. He held a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship at the University of Nottingham and is a lecturer in applied humanities for Birmingham Newman University. He is the founder and lead editor of the website badancient.com, which brings together specialists to fact-check common claims. I'll say that again. Which brings together specialists to fact-check common claims made about the ancient world. We are absolutely thrilled to talk with Owen about his new book, The Far Edges of the Known World, which is published by Bloomsbury Press. Welcome, Owen.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
An absolute pleasure. So, to get us softly into this topic, because I feel like this topic is actually huge, I'm wondering what sparked your fascination for this idea of borders and edges when it comes to the ancient world?
It's a valid question because it's not really talked about a lot, or when it is talked about, it's often in terms of conflict. So especially in the Roman Empire, we think hard borders, conflict and wars generally. So, put it simply, it bugs me that the ancient world is always done from cultural centers. So every time we talk about ancient history, we talk about Athens, we talk about Rome, Alexandria, places like this. And that's all fascinating and interesting stuff. But I'm always struck with the kind of question in my head of, well, what about everyone else? What's everyone else up to? And how do these highfalutin ideas that people are coming up with, like Plato and the like, how does that play out for, shall we say, normal people around the world? So first of all, it was to kind of get away from the obvious stories and the obvious narratives of the ancient world, ones that we've all read, listened to, and watched, and kind of grew up with. I suppose another aspect was I was really interested in the idea of the ancient world being the whole world. We often talk about, we study the ancient world, we love the ancient world, but all we really talk about is the Mediterranean or the Mediterranean basin, really. So, Egypt, Italy, Greece, maybe a bit of Turkey.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah, yeah, we all do it. And I just, I wanted to move away from that. And ultimately, I think it also played into an obsession of mine, which is I love underdogs. I've always loved underdog stories. From sort of watching films, growing up in England, watching films like Zulu, and I found the Zulus much more interesting than the British forces. Sort of watching westerns, and it was never the cowboys I was that interested in. My siblings used to always take the mick that I always supported the losing side, but I always just found their stories more interesting, and I found their cultures more interesting. So that's kind of like underpinning, shall we say, of what interested me in this. But otherwise, it's from a historical point of view, I hate inconsistencies, and what you often find when you read about Roman culture, Roman law, Greek culture and Greek laws is they stop applying the further away you get from Greece, from Rome. A classic example from the Roman period is the idea of the imperial army in particular. Soldiers, it's illegal for soldiers to marry. They're not allowed to marry. And this has influenced the way archaeologists have studied numerous forts and numerous sites over the years. And if anyone had ever thought early on to look at places like Egypt, for instance, we have loads of evidence in the Greek language that Roman soldiers are married. And then it turns out they're just not married in the Latin language. So you get this lovely interplay of an accepted rule breaking and almost like, okay, well, we can't officially say it, but of course you are. And as a result, like studies of Roman forts over the past 20 years have started realizing that perhaps, evidence of women or children in forts doesn't need to be explained with strange excuses. And actually, maybe they were supposed to be there.
What? What are they? So, what are the women doing there?
I know. What is this chaos?
There's a keep out sign very clearly on the door.
So it was just, I think looking at the borders just challenged a lot of what I grew up thinking I knew about the ancient world, what other people taught me about the ancient world, and I just found that really interesting. The way I often sell it to other people is from a more general point of view. If you look at the ancient world and only look at the center, you are basically committing the cardinal sin of a traveller who goes to London and thinks they've seen Great Britain. Mm-hmm. Goes to Sydney and think they've seen Australia, and you just haven't. You've seen something amazing. You've seen something flamboyant and spectacular and culturally fascinating, but you have not seen everything, and you have not seen anything close to everything. And so that was kind of what inspired the idea of the book in the first place.
Oh, that is really cool.
It is. And so for people who would like to pick up a copy of your book, you're going to take them to places across Africa, the Caucasus, and Asia. But as Roman historians, we're very aware that there are these very serious limitations when it comes to the way that Roman perspectives can be imposed and the kind of world that is created from Roman sources. So what were the challenges that you encountered when researching these edges of the world, and how did you tackle those challenges?
Oh, there were quite a few. I'll be honest with you. I suppose the biggest, I'm a historian by background. So my main bread and butter are written sources. So think Herodotus, think Plutarch, people like this. This is where I spend my time. When you start going to the edges of the ancient world, there's a lot less of it. And those written sources are either less interested in what's going on at the edge or have a very skewed perspective of what's going on at the edge. So first thing I had to embrace very early on was that archaeology was a much closer friend than sort of the standard historical text I'm used to working with. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, this kind of opens up opportunities. So we don't have large narratives from all these kind of sites. There are no large narratives coming out of Ukraine in the ancient period. There just aren't. But what there is alongside the archaeology in some of these sites are fascinating written sources that don't appear anywhere else. So oddly enough, whilst we obsess over Greece and Rome, our best evidence in terms of the amount of evidence and in terms of what it tells us about everyday life comes in the Roman period from two places, really, to my mind. One is Vindolanda, so that's a Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, where we have surviving written tablets from the fort. So we have a remarkably large cache of letters, basically, and notes from a Roman fort telling us what's going in and out, telling us what's happening. It's really boring, but it's really fascinating at the same time. And that's what I love, because, life isn't always exciting. So, there's lovely letters of people complaining they haven't been sent socks and things like this. It's just amazing. If you haven't seen it, anyone listening, you've got to have a look. They're great fun. But the other site, it's the site I look at, but actually it's the entire region of the Fayum region in Roman Egypt. So when Egypt is under Roman control, you've got the Fayum Oasis, which is to the southwest of what is now modern Cairo. Amazing place to go. And we have just a remarkable amount of papyri. So, the written paper from Egypt, just stored in people's houses whilst they kept them safe. So these are like people's personal archives, really. So it's documents that they want to keep safe, things that are important to them. Some of them are like contracts. Some of them are personal letters between like themselves and their mother or their father who might have died by that point. Some of them are just sort of family papers. So we've got all this amazing evidence just sitting there telling us about normal people, normal life, everyday life. So whilst I had to get away from this idea that history has to be grand narratives to write this book, what I get to really embrace is those small personal narratives and those little snapshots and stories of just normal people. And that's just something we don't really get to hear much about in the ancient world. But going back to like your point on Roman writers and the world they're building, this is such an important point. Because often when they talk about the edge of the world, one, they're really vague, and this is infuriating. I had to work with a map illustrator, and they were like, "You've mentioned Ethiopia as a region. Where is it?" And I was like, "South in Libya." And they're like, "Okay, so the country of Libya." No, Libya is a random continent, kind of makes up most of Africa at this point, but doesn't include Egypt most of the time. And they're like, "So where is Ethiopia in that?" I'm like, "To the south." I'm like, "Where?" That's all they tell us. So you got it's the same with you mentioned the Caucasus. The Greeks and Romans talk about Scythia, which is very vaguely north of the Black Sea and to the east. And that's kind of it. It can be as big or as small as you want it to be, depending on what you're talking about and who you're talking about. So they do talk about these things in general terms, because often what they're talking about is very, very far away land. So when they talk about Scythia, they mean very far away to the north and the east. When they talk about Libya, they mean very far away to the south. When they talk about Ethiopia, they talk about even further away to the south. India is my other favorite, because we think of India. India is a very clear place. The Romans, the Greeks knew about India. They went to India. They traded with India. They must know what India is when they talk about it, and they do not. Sometimes it includes the Arabian Gulf. Sometimes they're talking about much further east than India, the unknown lands of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, maybe even China sometimes. So they're not always, they're not consistent in their terminology at all. And I suppose the final point really when dealing with this is Roman writers in particular, if they're talking about the borders, it's usually to make a point about something else. And so we're always stuck with that question. How accurate a reflection are we getting about the place they're talking about? Some of these things can be overcome with archaeology. Some of these things can be overcome with other evidence. Some of it has to be left kind of open-ended. Ovid is a good example of this, and his description of a town called Tomis, where we don't have loads of evidence about Tomis, but we know he's wrong. But how wrong, we're not quite sure.
But definitely incorrect. Yeah, I was going to say you've led me straight to this idea of Ovid's perception of Tomis on the Black Sea, where he gets exiled to, because he's clearly not having a good time. He is most upset to be here. And he believes it's probably the worst place ever. At least that's the kind of impression you get from the letters that he writes back to the city being like, please, 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 guys, this exile needs to end. I cannot stand another minute here. But it seems to be, at least in the way that you're describing it, is that maybe it's quite jarring for him because he doesn't get to live the life that he prefers or is used to anymore. It's not so much that he doesn't understand the place. It's just that it's not something he wants to experience. So I'm wondering, like, is Ovid a bit emblematic for some of these problems we get with our bigger written sources when it comes to thinking about the edges of things?
Yeah, I think he is indicative of the issue. So much so he bookends my book for a reason. He really sums up not only the problem we have with Roman writers, Greek writers, Egyptian, all these different people, but also I think he's indicative of the problem historians have, where we're so stuck on focusing on what's not going on or what it doesn't look like, much like he does. We kind of miss it for what it is. But Ovid's a fascinating guy. He comes off a bit badly in my book. I think I went for him a little bit because he's held up in this kind of canon of Roman writers, and he is a moany so and so. But I think you're right. I think what he's moaning about is things not as they are, but also it's because he wants to go home. So much of his poetry, so much of his letters are about convincing people to petition on his behalf, send me home from his exile. So he portrays it in the most horrific ways. And if you read this, you just think, why would anyone ever go there? It is a nasty place. There's constant war, constant freezing. They can't even grow grapes. They don't speak Greek properly, which is laughable because it's a Greek city. He's moaning about all these things, and it's just fantastic. It's this idea of I'm too good for this place. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how he presents it. But on the same token, I'm not always 100% convinced that he's not just the reality of the town, but his own reality in that town. So, for instance, we know he brags at one point of writing a poem in a local language. So we get this idea he is learning local languages. He doesn't need to learn the local languages. Greek is a standard language. He learns like a Getic language. But he's not only learned it, he's mastered it enough to do his poetry. We know he serves in the militia, one of the things he moans about. They made me do military service, which I got out of in Rome. So there's no doubt he's actually getting quite involved in the community around him, but he'll never let on that he's in any way enjoying it or any way settling in. But the other thing, and it's the interesting one, something we get a lot at the borders when people from the centre, so these kind of figures, go there, is this idea of being forgotten. This idea of no one will know what's going on because no one really understands the edges. And if I'm there, they'll forget me. And Ovid has this kind of paranoia that he'll be forgotten and that mediocre poets in Rome will be remembered better than he will. And of course, we know in hindsight that's not true at all. So his greatest fear of being left at the edge just doesn't come true in the slightest. If anything, his time in exile I think some of his best work. I don't think every academic would agree with me there. But they're certainly historically the most interesting pieces of work he does. So yeah, Ovid, absolutely. He is emblematic of a lot of the issues we're seeing, but not just from the ancient world itself, but also from our own perspective.
Mm-hmm. As podcasters from Sydney, we kind of get that feeling. Always, our timing is just always off. We're always, in another day, in another time zone. It's
yeah, but you'll never be forgotten.
Stuff,
Remember that.
That's the dream.
We are writing the most epic podcast known to man. So, in scale.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So turning our attention away for a moment from the Romans and their world and their perspective, you also take the reader through some of the details of the borders that emerge in parallel to the cataracts along the Nile River in ancient Sudan. Can you take us through some of the details of the edges of the world as conceived in ancient Sudan?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So for the cataracts, so we're talking about these kind of insurpassable parts of the Nile, the cataracts. So they're basically heavy rapids. There's boulders and stones. It's just sort of harder to get through. It's not like a direct route, shall we say. And further south from these cataracts, you enter what's generally thought of as Nubia, the lands of Nubia. And this is like second millennium, we're well out of our wheelhouse for Greek and Roman historians, but second millennium BCE, where Egypt, has built its pyramids, has all its beautiful monuments, and the pharaohs have very well and truly established themselves on the throne. But to the south in Nubia, we have another kingdom called the Kushite kingdom, who are growing. A fascinating place. The archaeology of this area and this sort of kingdom and the towns they build are absolutely phenomenal, but there's no written text to work with. So unfortunately, it's one of the kind of curses of living at the edge. Your story is told by your enemies. and Egypt is the the writer of the history of the Kush. To put this in context, they generally refer to the Kush as the wretched Kush. That's their name for them. So that kind of gives you an idea of the storyline we're getting. So Egypt keeps trying to push its influence further and further south, moving up the Nile. And it does this by building a series of forts along the cataracts. Really, I mean, you can see this as expansion. You can see this as imperialist expansion. That's certainly what it becomes later in the New Kingdom. But at this point, I'll often visualize this as almost creating a buffer zone. So they're trying to create an area where the Kush are pastoralist people by origin, even though they're now building their towns and stuff. They still have sort of this semi-nomadic underpinning to their life. So movement around is quite a common thing, and sedentary cultures, urbanized cultures generally do not like nomadism because it doesn't abide by the rules of borders and things like that. Still true to this day, let's be honest. So they build these forts and they create this kind of middle ground within it. And what I found fascinating about this is we have a perfect example of a stretch of land where the two cultures kind of mash and mesh and intermingle. And rather than look at the Egyptians from their perspective further north, and rather look at the Kush from their perspective further south, I was fascinated by what was going on here in this middle ground, in this buffer zone. And ultimately what we get is Egyptian garrisons settling, raising families, and kind of setting themselves up in just normal life. It's just normal garrison life. It's not always very exciting. There's generally a lot of raiders, bandits, but also just trade. So it's that snapshot of the everyday, which I love. But we also get some lovely characters and some lovely events. For anyone who's if you're fans of The Mummy.
Oh yeah,
with Brendan Fraser. yes. Cool. What do you take me for? But also, I've just got into Assassin's Creed Origins, so I'm obsessed at the moment with the Magi.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that game.
Yeah, brilliant game, and they're brilliant characters in The Mummy. Where the Magi first kind of appear at this border as a group. Historians aren't 100% sure who they are in terms of ethnicity. But the general consensus at the moment is that they are one of the nomadic Nubian groups floating about in this region, in this area. So they're not Kush, and they're not Egyptian. They're this nomadic group, or one of many nomadic groups, and they're called the Magi. And they turn up in the fort records, basically, of people moving about. And this is where we first start to see them used as like a rudimentary police force. And to give you an idea of the kind of complexities of what's going on and the lack of simplicity of us versus them, the Magi, who form part of this nomadic Nubian group, are often policing other nomadic Nubian groups in the area. So they're like enforcing Egyptian rules on it. Because ultimately the fort brings food, it brings money, it brings support, it brings income of some sort, and so it makes more sense for them to look to the Egyptians for basically work. So we get individuals like this, but also we see in the forts themselves. We mentioned them earlier with the Roman forts, but we get these people. They're called women.
What?
And they do exist in history.
What's going on?
Just break this down for a second.
But interestingly,
women. I think I might have heard of them. Yeah.
Have you heard of them? My academic background is military history, and you'd be amazed you won't be amazed how many books are to where they don't appear.
It's incredible.
Yeah. We sympathise. Yeah.
And at the forts, what we see is Nubian women, even possibly Kush women, entering the forts and living in the homes of Egyptian soldiers and men. There's no reason to not presume that they've actually intermarried. So again, what we see, away from the narratives of the Egyptians, where there's wretched Kush and they can't be trusted and they're evil and they should all be killed because they're animals, we see at the borders soldiers who are supposed to be kind of enforcing that and epitomizing that ideology, marrying them, living with them, having kids with them. And I just find that amazing. I find it beautiful. I just think it's a fascinating inversion of what we expect.
It's almost
Anyway,
as
that's just an
though
aside.
when people actually get to know each other instead of believing what they're told, they actually find that humans are quite similar and they can get along with them.
I mean, you said it, not me. I don't want to get in trouble.
These are the kind of mind-blowing ideas that people come to the partial historians for, you know?
This is it.
Oh, boy.
This is it. It's beautiful stuff. It is beautiful stuff. But like within the sort of historical narrative, I mean, ultimately, Egypt goes through its own periods of chaos. And during that chaos, we see at the borders fluctuation. So during one of those periods of chaos where Egypt has basically an incursion from the north, the Kush push further north and actually take control of a lot of these fortifications.
Uh-oh.
Now, yeah, to put this in kind of perspective, these forts are enormous. Like, they're absolutely amazing in size, in scale. I mean, really, we see nothing like it in the ancient world until like the Roman structures thousands of years later, in terms of fortifications on the borders and in terms of the investment that goes into it. There's nothing quite like them. But the Kush basically walk into them because the Egyptians have to focus on what's going on further north. And again, you're like, okay, so the Kush have pushed north, taken control. This is going to be a bloodbath. Are they even going to keep the forts? What's going to go on? There is no archaeological evidence that there is any destruction.
Wow.
At all. So it very much creates this impression they just kind of walk in.
Yeah.
And we even have examples of Egyptians at the forts who keep their jobs.
What?
Yeah.
Now that's a kind of job security that I envy.
Exactly. It's exactly. I mean, from a pragmatic point of view, if you've got an infrastructure in place and they're happy to stay in place, there's no need to change it. So, you know, as long as they're not leaving and they're not constantly out to try and get you and to try and overthrow you, why wouldn't you keep them in place? So what we get is this lovely moment of... You're going to get me in a lot of trouble. So what we basically see is people go, right, like my dad was here under the Pharaoh. I'm now here under the Kush. Happy days. Let's just keep going. Because ultimately what happens, and this is what I love about the borders, what happens at the border is that's life. Life isn't what happens to the south or to the north. Life is what's going on there and then. And, you know, they're not going to uproot themselves if they've got family there, if they've got lineage there, if they, you know, they've been there 6-7 generations. This is their home. This is their homeland. It's at that point where you see where loyalties really lie. Now, that's not true of all the sites I talk about in my book. And that in itself is interesting because it gives you an idea of how, I don't know, how deep people will put their roots when they come to the edge. You know, how do they see their time there? But at the fort, we see these kind of forts, we see quite clearly people, that's home.
Yeah.
So, you know, why would they leave just because another king is asking for tax rather than the previous king who was asking for tax? You know, it's that kind of perspective. So I think that was it. Really, I wanted this kind of fortification boundary, these barriers. I wanted to look at it rather than through a lens of conflict and through a lens of imperial or political power. I wanted to see it through everyday life. I wanted to see it as normal, and just how life went on, even in places like this.
I love this sense of pragmatism about daily life that is coming through and is a real thread through this whole book, actually, because it's kind of like, what sort of decisions do you make when you're not the powerful person, when you're not the person writing the laws, and you find yourself, you know, I've been sent to this fort and I guess I'll figure out life from here. And, you know, opportunities come along, you make some friends, you meet a girl, it's kind of nice. And all of a sudden your family's been there for like 2 or 3 generations and you're like, oh, it's good here, you know. We're these kind of people now.
I think it also speaks to the universal human hatred of moving.
There's nothing worse than having to pack up all those boxes.
I hate it, and I'm glad to know that people in the ancient world hated it too.
Well, there we go. They are just like us.
They are so similar. And you touched on this idea of language with this idea of the wretched Kushite. Yeah. And I think this leads us really nicely into thinking about these really loaded terms that we tend to get when we think about the center versus the edge, and that idea of the civilized center and the barbarian edges. And these sorts of terms are hugely problematic, obviously been repurposed in terrible ways throughout all of human history, even recently. And I'm interested in how a study like yours can help us combat this sort of us versus them dichotomy that comes through in that kind of language use.
Yeah, I think ultimately it rips it apart. Absolutely rips it apart. It shows it for what it is, which is a rhetoric of privilege, basically, from the center. Because they can think like that. Because the only, classical Athens, for 5th, 4th century Athens is a good example of this. If you are Plato, living in, walking around Athens, the only barbarian, for want of a better word, the only foreigner you will meet is predominantly either a trader or an enslaved person. That's pretty much it. So you can have these kind of views, of foreign peoples, because it doesn't really affect you day to day. But when you look to the edges, where like we were talking about, you end up marrying these people. You end up living with these people. These people become your friends. These people become your colleagues. These people become your network for trade. You just can't. You just can't think like that, or you can't internalize all those beliefs of. Well, you can definitely internalize your belief of your own superiority, but you can't really internalize the belief of their innate inferiority in every way. So the idea that the barbarian person is intellectually inferior, morally inferior, in just every single possible way. It just doesn't make day-to-day feasible. So the distinction very much kind of falls apart when they live side by side. All right. So we see this in particular in the book. There are 2 sections on Greece, the Greek world and the Roman world, and it just falls apart time and again as you look at it. Ultimately, barbarianism as a construct and civilization as an idea usually appear in the ancient world to justify something, or to garner support for something. So think about, the anti-Gaul rhetoric just before Caesar's invasion. Think of the anti-Persian rhetoric after the Persian Wars in classical Athens. It's all to justify things that are either happening or are going to happen or have happened. All right. So you've got to see it for the ideological rhetoric it is. What I find quite interesting about it is if you take it at face value, it kind of counters a lot of stories we tell ourselves about our own history. Maybe not Australia.
I think definitely Australia.
I'll leave that with you. But a classic one in Britain. So British history, one of the key parts is the Roman invasion. We don't talk about ourselves as an invaded imperial opponent. We don't talk about ourselves like that. We talk about ourselves as the inheritors of the Roman Empire. So what we inherit in terms of the ancient history from the Roman period is that we take the role of the Romans, which is quite odd when you think about it, because we were not the Romans. We were.
I don't want to say that this is a classic English move, but
it is. It definitely is. But what we don't talk about, for instance, and I love this doing the research for the book, is just how much Britain is a backwater of the ancient world, just how looked down on, just how much it is looked down on. Like to the point where before the Roman expansion, really, the Greeks aren't even convinced it's real, because it just sounds so horrific.
It rains all the time.
I know, and it's not wrong, so we know they're right. But the other thing is, ultimately, it's the edge of the world. I mean, even the early Roman, early Roman imperial writers talk about it as literally the edge of the world. So it gets to this point where, okay, we accept it probably is real. But God, no human would live any further than that. And it's just amazing. So, what we inherit as British people is this story from the Roman perspective about Roman power. What we don't inherit is the Roman perspective on Britain itself, which is like, this is not a very great place to be. A very great place to be. And I just love that. I love that. I love not only the history of the ancient world, but also how the ancient world is translated into the modern day, and what bits of it we like to choose. And what bits of it we like to ignore. But in terms of the barbarian civilization, yes, I mean, the ancient world is the foundation of it to this day. You've kind of alluded to it already. I've said it outright. Britain has for a long time considered itself the inheritor of the Roman Empire. If it's not Britain, it's Napoleon. If it's not Napoleon, it's bloody the Third Reich. Everyone wants to be the Roman Empire. Everyone wants to be the harbinger of civilization, shall we say. And make themselves the inheritor of what they consider the lineage of civilization. And when you look at the edge of the world, you just kind of see how ridiculous an idea that really is.
I think somebody needs to tell Hollywood that, because I don't know if you noticed, but the Romans always have British accents. So
this does, as a side note, this does weird out my Italian husband. He cannot watch HBO's Rome because he is thoroughly baffled by the representation of Romanness through the English accent.
Well, did you see the whole complaint about Denzel Washington in Gladiator 2 having basically the New York accent? Is it a New York accent?
Yeah, whatever he
whichever
has.
accent
I think he talks like Denzel. That's
yeah, he does. It's his voice. And I just love it because people are like, this is the wrong accent. And everyone's like, you mean British, don't you? You mean he hasn't got a British accent. Which is just ridiculous. Fair point.
Yeah, well, look, I have to defend it because that's what Kirk Douglas was going for with his whole casting thing. He had real issues with certain people he wanted to cast who didn't have the right accent. He was like, the British versus American accent is so important. It must be preserved at all costs, regardless of acting ability. Anyway, moving on though. We really loved the chapter on the city of Olbia, which was located in what is now the Ukraine. Olbia draws influences from many peoples, and the result is a layered culture. Can you take us through some of the key moments in Olbia's ancient history as a city at the edges?
I mean, yeah, so we're looking at literally at the very edge of what is now Crimea. And it's set up as a market city, basically, to kind of capitalize on the trade of the Black Sea and to try and push Greek trade further north into what is Scythia, so the land of the Scythians, this elusive conglomeration of various nomadic, semi-nomadic, and static groups that the Greeks aren't 100% sure who they are. And Olbia goes through the history of Olbia is just fascinating. I fell in love with the city whilst writing about it, because basically it sets itself up, has to deal with the Persian expansion in the region, survives the Persian wars, but we don't know how, in what way. We don't know if it sides with the Persians. We don't know what it did to get by. It then has to deal with ancient Athens' expansion in the Black Sea. That's when the city becomes democratic, because Athens doesn't really give you a choice with this. It then basically can't really cope with being democratic. So it relies a lot on the patronage of rich individuals. It then has to deal with the expansion of Alexander the Great, the Macedonians. It survives that. It looks to Scythian kings, for want of a better term, for support and for protection over time. But in the end, it's abandoned for a period. We're not 100% sure why. It just kind of stops being a useful place to be. Too much conflict in the area. It's not worthwhile. And then, interestingly, some of the Scythian groups actually implore Greeks to come back and re-establish it. So Olbia is re-established, and that's when we get the Romans interacting with it. And there's a beautiful moment where one of our Roman writers is complaining because he goes there, meets a Greek guy, a young lad, whose Greek is very bad, apparently, and is dressed like a Scythian, which is a fascinating moment because the Scythians wear the most effeminate of clothing known to the ancient
Is it
Mediterranean.
pants?
It is pants, it is trousers. And he's described wearing them. He's also described holding a cavalryman's sword as well. So very unusual, very unexpected. And it's just the perfect encapsulation at Olbia of what's going on, which is Greek people clinging to Greek identity, but adapting and embracing Scythian or local traditions as well. And we see this in a few ways. So we see it in the coinage. Coins are not always the most exciting of things, but they tell us a lot. And at Olbia, they tell us an amazing story where the first coins we see at Olbia aren't round coins like drachma and things like that. They're actually shaped like arrowheads and dolphins. There's a lot of speculation as to why. It might be related to a cult of Apollo. These are two symbols of Apollo in the region. But they're also two symbols that relate closely with the culture of the non-Greeks in the region, let's call them Scythians, who put a lot of stock in archery as their sort of military prowess. And the dolphins is a local symbol because of the population in the Black Sea. So there is an argument that's been made that this is possibly evidence of them trying to get local groups to embrace a financial system that they don't have. So Olbia, the Greeks at Olbia are creating a monetary system that they can relate to and use in some way, which in itself is interesting. So by the time we get proper coinage, so the kind of round drachma in Olbia, what we see are symbols that relate to Scythian culture. So we see a distinctive bow, we see a distinctive bow case imprinted on the coins. We also see a particular axe, the sagaris, which is not Greek. The Greeks are not interested in it. This is clearly about giving a iconographic marker, an image that the Scythian groups or the local groups in the area understand what it is. And I just find that amazing. And it kind of feeds into something Herodotus, so the father of history, tells us about the region and about the city. He describes a group living near Olbia in his list of Scythians. He gives a long list of different Scythian groups. And in it, there's one which he describes as Greek Scythians, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you think of it through the perspective of barbarians and Greeks and separation. So what does he actually mean about this? And so it was, maybe they're living more of a sedentary agricultural life, maybe something like that's going on. But maybe it's because Greeks and Scythians are actually intermingling and living together and marrying and intermarrying. And this is actually supported by a later inscription at Olbia, which talks about a group called the Myxolenes, literally the half-Greeks, who live just outside of Olbia. So we have this kind of archaeological verification, corroboration, really, of what Herodotus is talking about. Yes, Greeks and Scythians. This isn't pie-in-the-sky hippie nonsense. These people are actually living together, marrying, intermarrying, raising families. Like, this is reality. This is what's going on. And to kind of come back to both your points earlier, let's contrast this with the center. So this point is Athens. In Athens, 5th century, 4th century, Plato has a little mini rant in one of his works about intermarriage. And he refers to a group called the Mixobarbaroi, so the half-barbarians. And I think this perfectly encapsulates the difference between the center and the edge. So in the center, if you intermarry with foreign peoples, you're a half-barbarian. At the edge, if you intermarry with other people, you're half-Greek. Don't get me wrong, you're still not Greek. You're still not quite us. But it just gives you that inverted perspective that you see at the edge. If we only listened to Plato, you would think that was all there was.
I do like this idea that not only is there sort of like fine sort of definitions within this, because that speaks to like people trying to like find their identity and position themselves in particular ways, and Herodotus seems to be picking up on that as well. But you've mentioned a couple of times now that when we get out into this sort of really eastern section, that there is a sense from people from the center that the Greek is spoken differently, for sure. And the idea that the accent is shifting and that maybe the language is bringing in loan words and things like this from the surrounding areas. And it's not that they're not speaking Greek, but it's not the Greek of the center, for sure, by the sounds of it. And to tie this back into thinking about your own journey as an author.
Yep.
This book takes us through heaps and heaps of places. And I feel like the thing that you would want to do to prepare to write for this book is to do a lot of travel and get to these edges and really, really come to grips with it from in the topographical sense, just feel what it's like to be in these places as well, because that would also decenter you as an author from your position in your natural center. And I'm interested in the sort of challenges that you have found in writing this book when it comes to that kind of thing.
Yeah. This book was not pitched at a good time for what I wanted to do. Because you're right, I had real plans to be a jet-setting historian. I was going to live my dream since I was a kid. I was going to go around the world, go to all the ancient sites and just write stories about them. It was going to be amazing. The first planned trip I had, so I got a chapter on ancient Vietnam, and I was like, it's the one place I've never been. I've never been anywhere like it. I've got to get to Vietnam. And I planned out the entire trip, and then the COVID lockdowns happened.
No.
Yeah. So that was great. So that scuppered that plan. It scuppered my plans to go to Ethiopia. It scuppered my plans to go to Morocco. I had ambitions. And every time lockdown was lifted, I was like, okay, I probably won't get to Vietnam now. Let's try Ethiopia. Okay, next lockdown. I won't get to Ethiopia. Morocco, that's just down the road a bit. Let's try that. Next lockdown occurred. By the time all restrictions were lifted, my deadlines were looming. So I had to readdress my expectations and my ambitions. So I was like, fair enough. I won't be able to get to that. I've got to look nearer to home to get to some of these sites. I'll go to Ukraine. I've got 2 chapters in the book. I'll go to Ukraine. As I came up with that plan, Putin tanks crossed the border. So that scuppered that plan. Another idea was I'll get to Israel. That was a terrible idea. Sudan, that was never going to start. Basically, everywhere I wanted to go, either terrible things that were happening, started happening, or in hindsight, went on to happen. So that was a bit of a problem.
It sounds like
so
you're
in the
a
end,
very powerful figure, Owen, on world history and current affairs.
You don't want to appear in my books, but I'll tell you that now. You don't want to be named in my books.
I was going to say, it seems like not a coincidence that all these places you wanted to go are still areas where sometimes you can't.
Yes. Yeah, there is something to be said for the edges of the world haven't changed that much in our own perspective. And that in itself is very interesting. And we do not have enough time to explore that one. But yeah, it is interesting just how many of these places are still considered these sort of no-go places or problematic places or difficult places, rightly or wrongly. They still hold these reputations. And as you can kind of see, some of these reputations go back thousands of years. I mean, to get around it, I ended up having to rely on a massive network of historians around the world, archaeologists around the world, many of whom I've never met, never spoken to, and bless them, they were so supportive and so helpful. Because we were all in the same boat. Anyone who wanted to write about any of these places, we were in the same boat. We couldn't travel. So as a result, I was able to tap into that and be sort of fed and guided to a lot of the cutting edge research. So a lot of academics were bored during lockdown. And so anyone who spoke to them about their own work got very excited. And so there was a lot of Zoom calls because they wanted to talk to anyone. And they were like, have a look at this draft that I'm publishing in 2 years' time. Have a look at this draft of stuff I've just found when I was last in Vietnam and all this kind of stuff. So the book, one of the things I liked about putting this book together was it was fed by a lot of the very, very current research coming out. And from my perspective, from your perspective and all the amazing work you do, I think part of our job is to kind of translate that for the public and feed it to them in some way. So I love the idea that we're not, I'm not feeding them a narrative that's been around for 10, 15 years in academia. Some academics will read some of this stuff and not know it's been discovered yet, not know it's come out, which is just beautiful because I think the public should be, as much at the forefront as everyone else.
Absolutely. And that segues nicely into a question we thought we used to sort of wrap things up, which is what questions or ideas would you like to leave listeners with when it comes to them thinking about the boundaries and the edges of the world?
I suppose I'd love you to be left with the same question that started the book. I don't like to think I've answered it because it was an open-ended question. But ultimately, my first question when it came to this book was, okay, we know Greece, we know Rome. What else is going on? So I talk about, I think it's 13 sites around the ancient world. I could have picked a completely different 13. And I just, if this book is to inspire anything, I want it to inspire inquisitiveness. There are lots of works, lots of podcasts, lots of documentaries about these other places. They're just not the big famous ones that everyone's kind of reading and watching and listening to. So kind of, follow your inquisitiveness. Because ultimately that's what history is. I mean, history literally means inquiry. It is to be inquisitive. It's not to tell narratives and have answers. It's to ask questions and to keep exploring. And that includes people who just love history. It's not just academics and scholars. So I suppose the other thing, which I'm glad you two picked up on as well. So it's we read a lot about ideas in Rome, in Egypt, in Greece, and all these places. A lot of ideas. How does that play out in reality? How does it play out in the other sides of the world? It's all well and good thinking what life is like in London. What's it like in rural Scotland? For the British example. So kind of, follow your own interests, follow your own inquisitiveness, follow your own questions. And I suppose the final thing for this, and we kind of touched on it at the end, does any of this stuff sound familiar? We're talking about life at the edge, we're talking about all these regions, we're talking about conflict, but we're talking about fear of foreigners, which is very easy to say when we live in the urban centre, fear of migration, fear of movement of peoples, fear of nomadism. In Britain, one of our most persecuted ethnic groups, or sort of ethnic minority groups, are the Gypsy, Romani and traveller community. The antithesis of sedentary life, constant movement. We can get very focused on why people don't like them right now, but actually, are we hearing a lot of the same themes, a lot of the same ideas from 2000 plus? I mean, with Egypt, 4,000 years ago. Are we just rehashing the same fears and the same concerns? And when we start to realize why they did it in the ancient world, you can then start to ask questions of, well, is that why we're doing it now? Ancient history has a currency in the modern world. It has a pertinence in the modern world. And I think books like this kind of encourage us to ask those questions and to look a little deeper at our own perspectives, as you both kind of rightly pointed out with me.
No, well, I mean, I think this is the thing in that we've talking a lot about barbarism and civilization and those sorts of ideas. As teachers of ancient history, I'm sure we've all encountered, I know I have, plenty of students who look at the past and say, oh, how ridiculous. Oh, they were so backwards. We've got all the answers now. And I constantly have to ask them now, I'm like, okay, if we have all the answers, then why is it this time period that's facing an existential crisis in the form of climate change, which people are still actually taking the time to argue about? I mean, do we have all the answers? If we do, I'd love to have a look at them.
Please show me that book.
Yeah, exactly. So when people do say to you when they encounter something that's very strange about the ancient past, obviously there's nothing wrong with laughing at the way that humans behave at any time period or in any place. But it is that idea that a lot of people have that now is the best and the past has to be therefore the worst. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the other thing, I suppose, one of the other drivers of this book, so you mentioned in my introduction, my lovely introduction, by the way, appreciated that, where I run this website, Bad Ancient, which is a website dedicated to kind of debunking a lot of misconceptions about the ancient world. Now, this isn't just pyramids being built by aliens and things like that. It's also perspectives. So we get asked questions from not a naive perspective, not even a ill-informed perspective, but a narrow perspective. And the answer isn't that you're wrong about a question about Roman culture or Egyptian life or anything like that. It's not that you're wrong, but it's that you're only giving an answer based on life for 5% of the people. A classic example would be, if If you look at the Egyptian evidence I mentioned in Roman Egypt, all these amazing papyrus, papyrological evidence we've got a lot of it which shows independent women living normal, independent women lives. But it's the classic, isn't it? If you pick up any ancient history book about Greece, Rome, Egypt, anything like that, you'll generally get this impression that women stay at home. Women have no autonomy, women have no authority. And there is some truth to bits of that. But we shouldn't limit their potential in our own storytelling of them and our own narrative of them when the evidence shows us differently. So there's a lovely village called Karanis, which is a very poor village in Fayum in Roman Egypt. And we have evidence of women running businesses. We have evidence of women living entirely independent of men. In one of the census records, we have all female households. So Roman history tells us there has to be a male guardian at all times. There has to be a son if it's not a father, if it's not a husband. But we have census records where that's just not true. There are still legal issues. They have to officially have a guardian, but that doesn't look the same in normal life. It's a paperwork issue.
That's fine.
Rather than an everyday issue.
You make a statue, you call it a dude, and you're like, that's the man. Don't worry about
I'm actually
him.
so thrilled to hear that Destiny's Child would have been very at home in this place.
So it's completely lost my train of thought, but ultimately this is it. So when we have our laughing moments in the classroom or in conversations about the ancient world and go, oh, they're very backwards and they're very this, they're very that. Yes, we've got to ask questions about ourselves. Yes, we can ask questions about how different are we really with a lot of these topics. But the other question is always worth asking, which is, well, how much of that is just an elite male perspective of what they think life should be like? Because on the edge of the world, evidence tells us differently.
Yeah, I mean, if we had only left behind the blog of someone who was part of like a, men's rights group, and that was it for a lot of civilization, I think our perspective on what was happening now would be quite different.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the idea that Aristotle was just a blogger, a really angry blogger in the basement of his mum's house.
And that Pliny the Elder was just a kook.
No one took him seriously.
He was all over the trivial details, that's for sure.
He had 50 cats.
That's right. It had belonged on Reddit. It had done great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Owen. This has been a real treat. And I'm very excited for people to get your book, The Far Edges of the Known World, into their hands and to get their eyeballs on the page and to do as much exploration of this kind of topic as they can, because there is so much fun to be had, I think, in coming to grips with like, what is life actually like when we don't just read elite men?
There's the tagline. Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Partial Historians. You can find our sources, sound credits, and transcript in our show notes over at partialhistorians.com. We offer a huge thank you to you if you're one of our illustrious Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the show, we'd love your support in a way that works for you. Leaving a nice review really makes our day. We're on Ko-Fi for one-off or ongoing donations, or Patreon, of course. Our latest book, Your Cheeky Guide to the Roman Empire, is published through Ulysses Press. It is full of stories that the Romans probably don't want you to know about them. This book is packed with some of our favourite tales of the colourful history of ancient Rome. Treat yourself, or an open-minded friend, to Rome's glories, embarrassments, and most salacious claims with Your Cheeky Guide to the Roman Empire.